Good evening and welcome to Restoration Conversations. We're here at the National Central Library of Florence at the show Women of the Sky, from muses to scientists. And on behalf of Calliope Arts, the National Library, and the Museo Galileo, we're so happy to be here. I'm Linda Falcone, and I'm here with co-curator Natacha Fabbri and rare manuscripts and books restorer Alessandro Sidoti.
Well, hello. Thank you for joining us into this conversation at the National Library of Florence.
Good evening.
So we are going to actually start with Natacha, and Natacha will take us through to see some things. And Alessandro, we will see you later on. We're going to talk about more structural elements linked to this center of restoration.
And the materiality of these objects also.
Our guests are very informed of the flood of 1966, of the role that the library played in creating or in advancing the science of restoration. So you're going to talk to us a little bit about all of the different needs of the things on show.
Yes.
Okay. We'll see you later on.
Yeah. Okay.
Ciao. Natacha, take it away.
It's a pleasure to see you again, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here with you with Restoration Conversations. And let me show you our first work, because when talking about women and astronomy, Dante's Divine Comedy is a milestone. And is a milestone because the third part of the work, Paradise, is characterized by the dialogue between Dante and Beatrix, the learned Beatrix. And she also explains to Dante and to the reader some very complex scientific and philosophical aspect of the sky, of the celestial spheres. For example, the nature, the scientific nature of the spots we observe on the moon, and many other topics.
So this is, I just want to stop here for a minute, because often from a literary point of view, we think of Beatrice as a muse. We think of her as an imaginary spiritual figure who is guiding him in this spiritual journey. But you're actually telling me that she is a teacher, and she's teaching scientific elements and natural sciences as well.
Philosophical issues and even theological topics, like in this case, she is explaining to Dante the divine nature of God by using a parallelism between God and the sun. Mm-hmm. Or even in this other case, let me show you this edition that is very, very important, because it's the first printed, illustrated edition of the Divine Comedy. And we have here an illustration of the golden ladder to Saturn, again, the dialogue between Dante and Beatrix. But this edition is important even for another reason. It's dedicated to a woman, a very learned woman, Elisabetta Petrovna, the Tsarina of Russia, the daughter of Peter the Great, and she was also the founder of the State University of Moscow.
So, Natacha, just to give people a perspective, so we have two different eras here, right? What time period are we looking at with the first?
In the middle of the 18th century here.
Okay.
In the other case, we are around 1930. It's a very huge and rare edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, illustrated by the great Italian artist Amos Nattini.
Okay, so here we're in the 1930s, in the era of industrialized paper, right? But this is handmade. And I just want to tell our guests that this is more than 60 pounds.
That's right.
That there are 100 images, right? One per canto. And it's quite a different contrast. And we'll see throughout the course of the show, and perhaps we can enter into Women of the Sky, and you can tell us all the different elements that we're going to be seeing as we go through. But most of all, I wanted to start by asking how a show like this comes about. It's a very unique topic, women in astronomy, and this is a very unique place. Normally you're at Museo Galileo, you're the scientific coordinator at Museo Galileo, and tonight you're a few palaces down the river, right? So how did you arrive at this place and at this show with your co-curators?
We would like to create with this exhibition a dialogue between the Museo Galileo and the National Library of Florence that hosts Galileo's manuscript collection, so it's the perfect partner in this case. And also we wanted to transform this amazing hall, the Dante Hall, in a temple of astronomy permeated by female presence, by female authors and artists and patrons and interlocutors, artists. The exhibitions includes many different sources. So we have manuscripts, books, engravings, musical scores, watercolor sketches and videos, audio recordings, and also art pieces.
So just before we go on to the art pieces, I wanted to make sure that Francesco gets the temple element, because this idea... The dome. The dome.
The dome
exactly,
of the temple.
Exactly. And this temple that you're creating, and it runs from the 1500s, if I'm not mistaken, to the early 1900s. So we have several centuries that you're looking at, and it really is a journey from muses, you might say, right, to scientists. So we go from allegorical women to flesh and blood women, to astronomy for all, etc. And tonight we're going to look mostly at real women and how science was dedicated to them, scientific discourse, how they became part of scientific discourse, etc. But we're going to actually start with a contemporary artist. And our guests will very easily see, and perhaps, Francesco, if you can go around and give them a look of Ilaria Marguti's panels. And while he's doing that, Natacha, if you would tell us a little bit about these very unique panels in embroidery by Italian artist Ilaria Margutti.
Ilaria Margutti was strongly affected by the work of Henrietta Leavitt, an astronomer who worked at the beginning of the 20th century at the Harvard Observatory. And he wanted to reproduce the work, the computation by Henrietta Leavitt on these canvases. But not only to reproduce just the shape of the Magellanic Clouds on which Henrietta Leavitt worked, and especially she worked on the photographic reproduction of these Magellanic Clouds, because she examined and she carried out a lot of research and computation of the plates that are today hosted at the observatory, Harvard Observatory. So, but she wanted also...
Can I just interrupt you really quick, because I want to give them some context?
Yes.
If you think of Harvard University and the different observatories, right? They, around the 1920s or up until the 1920s, from 1875, you have what was called Pickering's harem, right? Which was this group of women calculators, right? Or what we would also call women computers, okay? And how it came about is Charles Edward Pickering, who was an astronomer, a scientist at Harvard, one day quipped that his Scotch maid could make more precise calculations than the people on his team. And he really believed that women, for this type of very high concentration work of cataloging the stars, right, were very talented in this sense. They could be paid less, right? They had higher levels of concentration, and things could be published in the man's name.
Right. It's true.
So with the advent of photography and with the advent of slides,
of
astrophotography, women began to catalog slides, right? Rather than simply just looking at the stars having to record while you're looking, etc. During the night, they could then...
and to examine the photographic reproduction of the sky.
So that is what Ilaria Margutti is looking at. She's looking at slides.
Of the slides by Henrietta Leavitt, and she reproduced the shape of the Magellanic Cloud, reproduced even on the glass plates, examined by Henrietta Leavitt, and also the calculations that we find on these glass plates. The calculation by Henrietta Leavitt. But even more than that, because Ilaria Margutti wanted to reproduce not only the result, but also the process of discovery. So the same isolation, accuracy, silence. So we can imagine only the sound of needle and thread. And so try to reproduce scientific process by means of a typical female technique. So there is a universe, a poetical even universe, and a fascinating universe. And it's a very interesting way to communicate science.
This painstaking process, silent process. I'm hoping that the camera got close-ups, right? We can go later, as we move closer, we can stop and look at some of Ilaria's pieces. But did you want to go back in time at this point?
In addition to art pieces, we have literary, scientific, and even cartographic works talking about the connection between women and astronomy, women and celestial spheres. Like in this case, this is a rare, this is a rare engraving dating back to the beginning of the 18th century. And we have the three main astronomers explaining their astronomical system to the muse of astronomy, the queen of the sky, Urania in this case. And you can also see many different astronomical instruments and quadrants, sextants, armillary spheres, celestial globes. And another interesting aspect is the representation of the planets. The planets that you could see at the beginning of the 18th century with a telescope. And so we have the ring Saturn with the ring, the satellites of Jupiter, Mars with the different colors on its surface, the phases of Venus and Mercury, and the Earth-like moon. So the moon covered with chains of mountains and valleys, what we call today craters. So it's a way to popularize science. So it's a very important document.
But there was also this combination of allegorical element, Urania, who is the mother of the skies, no?
Allegorical and scientific element. A perfect blend of art and science, even in this case. And this engraving is also a sort of compendium, a summary of the astronomical knowledge at the beginning of the 18th century.
Just to let you know, it's produced in Zurich in 1707, right? So that they can have a temporal idea. So post Galileo, right?
Post Galileo.
Quite advanced. What else are you going to show us, Natacha?
So we are Muses and the choir, even the sonic dimension of the harmony of the universe, a sonic dimension represented by women's voices, a female choir that corresponded to the harmonic structure of the Ptolemaic, in this case, universe, the geocentric universe.
So they believed, when you say sonic universe, they're talking about the universe having vibration, right, and having sound. So this was a concept that was already...
This is an acoustic representation of the perfection and order of the structure of the universe.
And is this where we are?
Yes, this is the stage setting of one of these representations. It's a performance in Florence in 1589, and we have the choir of Muses and the choir of celestial sirens as well. And here the musical scores of the music
but this
performed by women.
This was a sketch for a performance, if I'm not wrong, right? For a wedding.
For a wedding.
Of our friends.
Celebration of the wedding of Ferdinand I and Christine of Lorraine. Yes. This very important union between the Tuscany and the granddaughter of the Queen of France.
So why was it so important to link the Medici dynasty with the stars and with the cosmos? I guess that's one of my main questions when we're looking at these manuscripts. Some are dedicated to Medici women, etc. What can you tell us from that point of view?
One of the reasons is that the founder of the Medici family was Cosimo de' Medici, and there is an etymological root between Cosimo de' Medici and the cosmos, namely the universe. And celebrating the perfection of the universe was also a way to celebrate the perfection of the perfect government of the Medici family. So it's a
perfect order.
Order.
Right? Order. Interesting. So
but
did it work in terms of marketing? I mean, in terms of marketing, it worked.
It works.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah.
It works.
Where would you like to take me?
Here. So let's quit the dimension of Muses.
Okay.
And I'd like to show you this context, because it's the context of a dialogue among women and authored by women as well. So we have here this writing by Moderata Fonte, and I would like to draw your attention to the title of these two works. So, on the worth of women,
right,
and on the nobility of women. And so Moderata Fonte tried to celebrate the nobility of women in different fields. Not only, of course, in a domestic domain, but also in science. And in this dialogue, she describes even the relationship between the moon and the earth from a scientific point of view, namely the influence of moon on tides, on agriculture, and on women, on pregnancy, and on the cycle of women.
But Natacha, I guess I want to ask you to start from the beginning, right? Because she's very specifically placing these two titles, the worth of women and the nobility of women, within a dialogue between women. So this is conversation.
A
right?
conversation.
Printed conversation.
Not a choir of Muses, but a conversation among women.
Okay. And so what gives the women their value and what gives the women their excellence? Is it the possibility to participate in this scientific discourse? Would you say?
They were excluded from scientific education, from philosophical education. But these authors, Moderata Fonte and Lucrezia Marinella, stress instead the need to include women, even in public debates on scientific issues, and not only on domestic topics. So it's very important, and also stress the need to claim for their for gender parity and for intellectual parity as well.
And so what year are we looking at here? Because this is the 1600.
1600, both books.
Okay.
This is a posthumous edition, and this is instead was published in 1600.
Right, and so we're moving towards the age of enlightenment, right? The age of science.
And one of the chapters of this book is entitled On Women Scientists.
And
why they need to participate in scientific debates, in public scientific debates, and to gain also a public recognition for their contributions.
So, Natacha, this is your field today, right? We're looking 400 years later. Are we still at the same point?
Not at the same point, but it's still difficult today. It's still difficult, I have to admit.
Yeah. And this is one of your objectives with a show like this one. And on that point, I do want to tell those of you who are watching, part of the legacy of this show is to create a digital library that will be that you can visit, right, on the Museo Galileo website, and from home look at these books as well. No, that's part of something that you're working towards in order for schools to become more active in the sciences, and particularly from a historic perspective, which is really interesting.
We would like people, and especially new generation, to be more aware of the long-lasting permanence of these topics, of the topics concerning female issue, female question, and the dignity of women, and gender equality, intellectual equality. So it's important for us that, because we think that memory and cultural heritage shape our identity, our personal and cultural identity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And really on that point, I mean, this idea of sharing cultural identity, I do want to go back to Ilardia's works as well. One of the reasons why she chose embroidery, and we can look here, an example, is for this idea of the circle, right? The embroidery circle, where women would share stories through generations. They would share fairy tale and myth and experience, right? So I find actually how the show is organized to be really, really skillfully done, because it responds both to the sewing circle, but you're actually sewing the stories of the stars.
It has a polyphonic nature, no?
Exactly.
A polyphony among different women, different identities, different sources, different epochs, and different souls, even different minds. It's very important to stress the element of the difference of the polyphony and not the monody.
Yes, yes. So multiple and multifaceted views and visions.
Different disciplines, fields, and so.
Congratulations, really. I'm very, very excited to be here, very excited to share this show.
It's a great pleasure for me and for us as well. And let me show you this writing. Mm-hmm. The author was a very important philosopher, Renaissance philosopher, Alessandro Sidoti, who dedicated this work to a learned woman, Laodomia Forteguerri, with the aim to conduct her through the celestial spheres, and following the model of Dante's Divine Comedy, but with a different idea of celestial spheres, not the celestial spheres of the literature, but the celestial spheres of astronomy, of the science of the sky, of the astronomical systems. And this is instead a commentary of a very important medieval astronomical treatise, and also a star atlas, one of the first printed star atlas.
So, sorry, just to get this straight, this was the dialogue with the woman is in the dedication, or it's actually in the text?
In the dedication.
Okay.
In the dedication.
Okay.
And it's conceived to explain to a generic public, more or less, generic public, because always very learned public, astronomical matters, but astronomical topics.
Was that what actually happened? I mean, were these texts then read by literate women? Were they studied by women?
Even by women. And we have, for the first time, a representation of the different luminosity of the stars that compose the different constellations. So it's a very accurate reproduction and image of the sky.
It's interesting because if you go back to Henrietta Leavitt, who we were speaking about before,
there is a continuity, a fil rouge.
She
connects different
discovered
showcases.
the yardstick, right? She discovered the yardstick to measure the stars based on their luminosity. So it's interesting that you bring a very early text into the conversation, from that point of view.
Let me say a few words about a very remarkable woman. It's always a big emotion to see a manuscript from Galileo's collection. Like in this case, this is a letter that Margherita Serrocchi an important writer, addressed to Galileo in 1611. And Galileo published his masterpiece, the Sidereus Nuncius, in 1610. And in this letter, she explained to Galileo that she was using the telescope and she observed the sky, the surface of the Earth-like moon, the satellites of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and not only, she tried to convert other natural philosophers as scholars to the truth revealed by Galileo's telescope. So she is she's very involved in astronomical topics, and she was also celebrated by her contemporaries for her skill in mathematics, astrology, astronomy as well. And she wrote an important epic poem. So she was a Renaissance woman, and not a Renaissance man, a Renaissance woman.
Exactly. Well, also because she wasn't a scientist. So
she wasn't, no.
She was an epic poet, right? And in fact, I found it interesting in reading about her. She was considered a monster in her time. She was classified as a monster.
Unnatural, no?
Unnatural.
Natural. It's
Exactly.
interesting.
But the reason is because she so clearly depicted battle scenes and military scenes and scenes of violence, etc. So they considered her something unnatural, right? But in this text, she's actually complaining.
Yes.
Okay, so she's saying, yes, I see this, I see that, etc. But what?
She admitted that she was disregarded by other natural philosophers because they were maestri, teachers.
Yeah, they were masters.
And she was a woman.
But
intellectually inferior to them.
Right.
Considered intellectual.
Natasha, at one point you had told me that these natural philosophers didn't want to look inside the telescope because they considered it something that would distort reality, right? Whereas she, because she didn't have the training, she could freely observe the skies in Galileo's telescope. This is just a few years before he got in trouble with the Holy Inquisition, quote unquote holy.
20 years before.
20 years.
20 years before.
Yeah. All right, so...
Let me show you another remarkable and prominent woman.
Please.
This is a portrait of a very skilled mathematician and astronomer, I would say, because we have here Elizabeth Hevelius, the wife of the great astronomer Hevelius, and here she's represented in the act of observing the sky, of using a very complex astronomical instrument. And it's a revolutionary document for the time because we are in the second half of the 17th century.
So to actually show a woman who's no longer Urania, who's no longer the mother of the skies, but in fact a scientist.
A scientist, an astronomer.
Okay.
Using a very complex astronomical instrument.
And this idea, because we see a lot with
examining
artists.
the sky.
Yes, exactly. But we see a lot with artists. Women became artists because their husband, because their father were artists. And here we have a woman scientist who is married to a male scientist. Is that the same within the scientific discipline?
Of course, she benefited from a very a positive context. It's a very rare also context. But she was also a good astronomer because she curated a posthumous edition of the Uranographia. Uranographia was the title of one of the masterpieces of her husband, or Hevelius. And Uranographia was a complex, very complex treatise, astronomical treatise, describing the constellations and representing the constellation with an amazing blend of art and science. So
we see that in many of the manuscripts that you have on show, this combination between art and science. And unfortunately, I think in today's world, it's very, there's a lot of division, no? between art and science, and we don't study the disciplines together, the two disciplines together. Do you have one more thing to show me?
Yeah. Just two little sections.
Two sections.
Two sections. Okay. So this is the work by Fontenelle, and we can see a gallant dialogue concerning the structure of the sky, and Fontenelle is explaining to a noble woman the cosmological model of a philosopher, French philosopher, René Descartes. She is not a learned woman, but she is interested in science and interested in natural philosophy as well. This work, this is the representation, very delicate and amazing representation of the cosmological model by René Descartes, explained by Fontenelle in the text. And the core of the text is the infinite number of universes, the infinite number of astronomical systems.
And they're just discovering that now,
yeah.
The multiverse. No? They're just working on it now. But I think this is very nice because it's an image of what you were talking about before with the nobility and worth of women in words, and here we see it in pictures. And this whole genre that developed in this period of time of women being with Dante, Beatrice was the talker, right? And here she's the woman is the listener and asking questions and naive questions as well. But it's very interesting to see this conversation.
Also because with Beatrice is a disembodied woman. It's a spirit. She's a spirit. In this case, we have a gallant dialogue between two people, a man and a woman. And Fontenelle strongly believed that women should be included in science.
And there were several women working with him as well, no?
As well, of course.
Yeah.
And this is the birth of what we call today the popular astronomy. So, and we are at the end of the 17th century, so it's...
That's really amazing. But here we're back at Dante, I see.
Back Dante, because this is the section devoted to Ernesto Capocci di Belmonte, the director of the Astronomical Observatory of Naples, of Capodimonte. And we have here an example of Capocci's perfect dialogue between science and literature, because Capocci wanted to continue Galileo's work on Dante, because Galileo commented the geometrical structure of hell, described in the Divine Comedy, and Capocci, instead in this tiny work, commented each verse, each canto of the Divine Comedy concerning astronomical matter. So it's the beginning of a new literary and scientific genre. So it's very relevant even for this reason.
Absolutely. It's like the Cliff Notes. Americans will know what the Cliff Notes are. I don't know if that's true in other countries, but definitely the notes that take us to a better understanding of these very high principles, scientific principles and moral principles as well. Natacha, do you have one more thing?
The last
Yes.
work, because it's the first report of a scientific expedition of a woman on the moon. So there is, it's published in 1857, and there is a significant connection with today, with the NASA Artemis mission. The NASA Artemis mission is referred to the goddess of the moon, Artemis. And during this mission, we will have the first landing of a woman on the moon, maybe in 2025 or more likely in 2026. So it enables us to create a bridge between past and present, to history and current events.
So this is a short story?
Mm-hmm. The protagonist was named Urania,
okay.
But she's not a muse. She's an astronaut, and she tells us about the geological structure of the surface of the moon and a lot of different scientific details of the moon. It's not an oniric or ecstatic journey. It's a scientific expedition on the moon.
And you have to know that she is the author of a book on the moon, right? Published 2 years ago?
Yes.
Was it? And the title?
Is Profili di donne sulla luna.
So Profiles of Women on the Moon. I've read it. It's very difficult. But with all my admiration for you, really, Natacha.
No, thank you,
And
Linda.
thank you for
for
hosting
your
us today.
for your time and your interest.
Grazie.
It's always a great pleasure.
Likewise. I'm going to go search out Alessandro and see what he can tell us about some of the things that you've been talking about from a material point of view. So I will leave you now, and certainly, again, utmost gratitude to you for this show, together with your co-curators, Caterina Guiducci and Simona Mamana, if I pronounced that correctly.
Perfect.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you,
So,
Linda.
grazie. Ciao. Alessandro, I was looking for you, so here you are in time, right?
Yeah, well, right. So we're going to connect again with the concept that you were starting before, and we were talking about the flood that is nowadays part of the history of the collections of our library.
Yeah.
And by the way, 2 of the books that you see here in this bookcase were actually affected by the flood in 1966, and they were restored in our conservation workshop. Now, the flood itself was actually a turning point for all the conservation work done into most of the libraries throughout the world. And our conservation workshop was actually born through the flood.
Right.
And it's interesting from this point of view because they even thought later on, the people involved into the flood, about exhibiting books. So some of the people involved through the Florence flood actually designed the book cradles. So the plexi cradles used for exposing books are actually
A product.
a product of the Florence flood in a way. I mean,
So I just for those who are not entirely familiar with the flood we're referring to, the flood, the Arno River flooded the National Library, perhaps you saw with the footage, is right by the river. It's riverside.
unluckily.
14,000 tons of mud and rubble invaded the city on November 4th, 1966.
Yes.
Destroyed
Destroyed
millions of books?
Well,
couple million?
Yeah, well, into our library, I would say they affected about 1/3 of the collections. Now you have to think that our library actually grew a lot from the flood on. So about in these days, I would say about 1 million of bibliographical objects. Now, together with bibliographical objects, I'm not just talking about books. There were a lot of newspapers that was affected by the floods, but also geographical maps and even antique books. So part of our antique collections were actually flooded because they were stored underground.
So, Alessandro, today, because the National Library, the National Central Library of Florence, actually stores a copy of every single publication published in Italy.
Yes,
right?
It's a huge task from that point of view, and we are meant to conserve them. That's the drawback from...
That's a drawback.
Yes,
right?
we need to keep all of them, and nowadays they are becoming a huge effort trying to keep all of these copies, and we are now over 8 million of books. And in 1966, when we had the flood, we were close to 3. So the increasing number is just continuously advancing in the numbers and measures of the library itself. It's just growing so quickly.
And I read something like 140 kilometers of books.
Yes, of shelf space. Because
almost 9 million books.
Yes, because we measure the books by the meter. That's what we do in national libraries throughout the world, because, and I mean, it's one of the largest, of the two largest libraries in Italy. So, but the difference also is that the antique collections of the library are very important, because the National Library of Florence is a library of libraries, is a collection of other libraries gathered into ours. So we do have into our collections a lot of various antique materials, and exposing these kind of antique materials is actually quite difficult, because books are not meant to be exposed, actually.
Yeah. So you were saying something about Florence becoming a center of restoration after the flood. Yeah. Now it's one of the foremost centers in the world for restoration.
Yes, and
you seem dubious.
Well, the thing is that the legacy of the Florence flood actually scattered throughout Europe and even the States. So some of the people that actually worked a lot with us just left a long time ago, and so the legacy evolved in a different way in different countries. So I would say for most in Italy, but when we are talking on a broader ambience from this point of view, I would actually say that this is not really true. There is other schools that are very important. So American conservators are very good nowadays, and British conservators are still very good, even compared to what they were through the flood. So what was important is that in Florence they gathered all together from the Florence flood experience, and they learned from that experience. So then they evolved from this. So this is a very important thing, that we call it as a turning point. So it's not that our experience as Florentine conservators is giving to them more information, but it's more the fact that a lot of people gathered in Florence and evolved as conservators into this specific situation.
And it opened the field to women.
Yes, that's true. Actually, most of conservators, book conservators nowadays, are women. But at the time through the flood in the 60s, they were mostly men. So there was a big change from that point of view, because most of them were actually bookbinders. So they moved on as a work. They stopped doing, just rebinding books and start thinking about conservation.
So on this point, Alessandro, because here we're looking at, with Natacha, we saw a piece linked to the marriage of Christina of Lorraine and Ferdinando. And here we have Francesco I and Bianca Capello. Yes. And this image, this wonderful image of this chariot with Venus, etc. So it's this beautiful image. But you had said something before about a cradle and the Florentines inventing a cradle. We don't know what that means.
Right. A cradle is just a support for the three-dimensional object that we are trying to keep open. Now, you have to think that books are not meant to stay open all the time. So they are actually meant to be handled during the reading. Now, this is a very unusual way for the object to stay. So this is not as they are meant to be. And also, this is a peculiar object because it's just turned the other way around. It's just a landscape, even though the book. So the shape of the books actually change the way we have to expose it. This one had to have one cradle made for it just to expose it in a different way. And even the angle of exposure could actually affect its conservation. So we have to think that every book is meant to be assessed from a conservator just to understand if it was to be able to withstand actually an exhibition. Because sometimes books are just not feasible for an exhibition.
This is important from our perspective, Alessandro, because the show and the magazine is restoration conversations, right? So really when you're looking at exhibition of art and of manuscripts, etc., you have the curators who are working on content, and then you have the restorer who comes in and makes problems for everybody.
Yes,
right?
we always
You're the bad
make
news
problems.
guy,
Yes, and
right?
sometimes we even say no. Yes, we just say no, this can't be exposed. And sometimes it's a compromise. We have to work on some of the objects that need to be conserved before an exhibition. This is becoming more and more unusual way of working, that conservator assess the conditions, and most of the times we do a bit of touch-up, just a little conservation, just to have these objects be able to withstand.
Just gonna move you here.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You prepare the objects to make sure that they're safe for conservation. Now, when you were saying before the fact that, and this you will see, our guests at home will see that this is linked to what we saw before with Natacha. So we're looking at Bontalenti's sketch, which is linked, I'll just remind you, linked to the wedding of Cristina de Lorraine and Ferdinando I, right? Because when the Medici got married, they had huge performances linked to the cosmos, etc. Yes. But you were discussing before the fact that books aren't meant to be oftentimes displayed, they aren't meant to be open. So from a conservation perspective, what does that mean?
This means that for us, exhibitions can be a crucial point, that we have to be aware that there is some risks for conservation. Now, every object we have to think that is on one handmade object. That means that everyone can be different from that point of view. So some of them needs to be studied to be sure that they can withstand the harshness of an exhibition. In this case, our main concern was light. So this beautiful light that you're seeing nowadays, is not what is usually on show. So usually light levels are lower, and also we have filters onto our display cases, just to be sure that we don't have any UV lights that will harm these kind of objects. Now you have to think that our materials are not only mineral-based, that are usually very light-fast and stable, and sometimes we have organic matters inside the colors.
So what would that be?
It could be a vegetable dye. So vegetable dyes are usually tending to fade quite quickly. And also you could have some organic lacquers, especially with purples and reds that you can find. So these kind of transparent colors, they can be quite tricky from that point of view. So when we choose what to exhibit, the tendency is more and more to study if this kind of object can actually be exhibited. Because sometimes you just have to say no.
But today
as a
you're
conservator.
saying yes, because I did ask you for a special privilege for Restoration Conversations.
Yes.
And it was granted because I sent you in. I said, if we're going to get permission, I have to send the restorer in, right?
Right.
We're going to see that in a little while. But first I wanted to stop here. You called this book, when we were talking together before filming, you called it a time machine, and I wanted you to tell the audience why.
Yeah, the whole idea of a book as a time machine is the whole idea of the fact that the structure of a book is meant and constructed to preserve its content. So the fact that it's shut and closed and obviously in the dark, so not exposed to the light and not exposed to being touched by hands, and these preserves the content and makes accessible to something that it looks like it was a long time ago. If these, like this one in particular, would have been exposed for this long time, you would have probably having something much paler than you would have nowadays in your hands. Right. So the manuscripts and even the printed books are an incredible source of information about early days, especially the materiality of these objects. So if you're looking for antique leathers, parchments, or even pigments, you do find them much more preserved into these kind of objects. And we do have to learn from these kind of structures that we need to just transfer them to the next generations. So we are just bridging, just taking these objects to the next ones.
Absolutely. So when you want to preserve a book properly, right? Yeah. Because we have the style of putting our books in our shelf, right? And conserving them vertically.
Right, the standing of the books. Well, you have to think that books were not meant to stay upright. So it is a rather new thing of the 15th century.
So a new thing from the 15th century.
Yes.
Right? Because in American perspective,
that's a very long time ago. But if you think about the physical object as the codex form is starting from the beginning of the first millennia, that we start folding the pages and holding them together. And for a very long time, I would say roughly more than 1,000 years, the books stayed flat. Nowadays, obviously, as we have more and more books, we can't afford to keep them flat anymore. Right. So it's a matter of space, really. Yeah. And when we were talking about the materials composition of the objects, we do have different objects on show. In this case, this is a composition of letters, actually letters that were bound together. So is, as I sometimes describe it, is an exchange of emails of that time.
From 1611.
Yes, that's the whole idea. So they are just writing one to the other.
With Galileo.
Yes, but still, the interesting part is that all of these letters have been rebound and connected together, but they are still keeping all of their material information.
Yeah, Davide, could you get, please, just this, I don't know if you can see it with the glass, but if you could get the actual pages from this perspective. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that these kind of materials are actually much more durable than much more modern materials. This is an interesting thing. So when you are approaching 15th century, 16th century paper, you do feel the difference compared to what we have nowadays. But on the other hand, the inks that were used, this is iron gold ink that was a very common, widespread use.
Iron gold.
Iron gold, the gold.
Iron gold.
And is the gold that were taken from oak or other trees is usually coming from an insect that puts, so it's the reaction of a very tannic tree that it creates these golds that are concentrating an acid. So it's a mixture of a tannic acid and iron salts. Now, for making this kind of ink, the problem is that, as I said, this ink is acidic. So what we have is the technique that is actually damaging the paper itself. So sometimes we do have problems coming from the inner object. It's not coming from anywhere else. It's just
not coming from the environment.
No.
Okay.
In this case, we have the problem that these kind of inks should be not in touch with the humidity. So yes, this environment is under humidity control because we have to be aware that giving humidity will speed up the degradation process. So it's something that we have to be aware that we want a very stable environment for these kind of objects. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but does the library have that stable environment in the stores?
Yes, it depends on the stores, but this is in the manuscript department. Yes, this is the most.
You are a specialist in manuscript and rare books.
Well, yes, but we are trying to keep everything as good as possible, obviously.
So you can avoid restoration.
Yes, that's preventive conservation is what we love as the most, because
Yeah, I know.
even though we
I'm
like
gonna
doing
just
conservation,
let him say his spiel. Go ahead, tell them
Yes.
the most important thing.
the most important thing is prevention. Prevention against any kind of damage, because this is what we really want. You have to think that we have so many books around the world that if we would need to restore all of them, we wouldn't have enough conservators or time, or there are just too many pages, too many objects. So we need to preserve them at first. And also, conservation is damaging. We are still losing some information. So if we could not do any conservation, even if I am a conservator, so I would like to do all this work, but it's something that we have to be aware of. We have to try to do a step back and just try to do as less conservation work as possible.
So you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yes.
Right? But
Right.
no, it's important. I think it's an important message. And here we are with our surprise,
Yes.
Alessandro, because this is where I sent the restorer in, right? Because
Right.
I want to show, show this little book, which we're going to look at up close, is normally inside of this display case, and it's under the magnifying glass. So specially for us, with Alessandro here, we received permission to look at this book. And can you show us, show us what we should be reading these days?
Right, that's the interesting thing of it. And if you think about it, how hard it is to handle this kind of object, you can understand that it's extremely difficult trying to exhibit something like this without damaging it. So in this exhibition, you would actually have your own show closed, because there is no way to hold it safely without just keeping it in your hands. So what we have decided at the end is just showing it as, a physical tiny object as it is. But the interesting thing is that it's printed inside. So yes, there is some text. I know that is extremely difficult to read through.
Are you getting it? Are you getting it? Go closer. I think, first of all, they're dying to know what this book is. So this book was, and you'll remember from our restoration conversations at Museo Galileo, Galileo wrote to Christina of Lorraine, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
It was part of his letters that he wrote in order to get her support for his very revolutionary theories, etc. And this is I can't even say pocket version. It's a mini thumb version, exactly, of this book. And in order to do the typesetting, Alessandro, they would have had to use tweezers to put.
Definitely, and I guess that they had to have them made on purpose, these types, because they are so tiny. And so this is something that is extremely unusual for us. This is a tiny version, and this just shows you how difficult it can be to handle.
So also
Objects,
everyone
libraries.
who's watching is quote unquote freaking out because you're using your bare hands. So I want the justification.
Yes.
Give us the lowdown as to why you're using your hands to
Right. So clean and dry hands are actually the best way for handling these kind of objects, because you need a very fine handling procedure. And the use of gloves can be risky from this point of view. So especially white cotton gloves, they are very flimsy, very difficult to handle with these, especially the pages. Turning pages with cotton gloves is terrible. So what we are tending nowadays is just to advise.
Internationally?
Yes, well, the National Archives in England, they just banned the use of gloves. So they said you can't use gloves. Wow. So you have to use them in some specific kind of materials, like photographic materials. Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that you need to use them. And I mean, most of us that have been, growing with the use of analogical pictures, they know that you can do a lot of damage, especially on film and other things. They can be damaging. But with these kind of objects, we don't advise the use of gloves, except for one thing, and is when you are sure that your object is some way toxic. And this can happen. So sometimes we do give this kind of advice if we know that the material that are making the book or the manuscript have some inner toxicity. They can be chrome-based, lead-based, even arsenic-based. So sometimes gloves are for the reader and not for the book.
Alessandro, it's been wonderful to speak with you. I just want to make a final point, well, two final points if I can. One is really that your participation here tonight gets us thinking about restoration as a chemistry and not just a manual craft, which I think is really important. In the same way that we need to link science and art, we need to link science and restoration, and that is something you do here at the Biblioteca Nazionale. So it's really exciting to hear you talk about the different elements, the materials.
Yes, well, we have to think that we need a deeper knowledge of the materials that we are working with. More and more we are actually learning that it's just through diagnostics that we can actually pinpoint the right treatment that could be done. So it's not just a matter of experience and is not just a craft. So our work is thrilling from this point of view because we have a mixture of different knowledge that are gathering together. And nowadays, more and more, we are confronting with other specialists as well. So it is more and more teamwork. So yes, it is changing a lot, and we like it.
That's exciting. That's exciting. But my last point, and then we will have to say goodnight, is that historically, I just want to tell you that the more books become portable, the more you have literacy among women. And that is true from the 1300s onwards, etc. And I think it's really exciting to end with this tiny
the size and is coming more and more portable. And the printing is what it made a huge difference from this point of view. Yes.
Absolutely.
So it was a huge amount of tiny books coming out. So yes.
The show will continue until the 8th of June. I wanted to extend my final thanks to Calliope Arts, who is the sponsor of tonight's program, and to the Biblioteca Nazionale, who's hosting us, to Museo Galileo, this wonderful show, this wonderful opportunity, our partners, the Florentine, Bunker Film, Francesco behind the camera, Davide, and the other two curators as well. Caterina Guiducci and Simona Mamana, who certainly are hello, a shout out to them, and grazie mille. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.